The article investigates the law enforcement practices in Ferguson, which disproportionately harms African American residents, driven partly by racial bias. Key findings include disproportionate stops and searches. African Americans, despite being 67% of the population, accounted for 85% of traffic stops, 90% of citations, and 93% of arrests from 2012 to 2014. They were 2.07 times more likely to be searched during a vehicular stop, but 26% less likely to have contraband found. They were also more likely to receive multiple citations and face arrest. Use of force. African Americans accounted for 88% of force cases by Ferguson Police Department officers and 100% of cases involving canine bites. Specific charges. African Americans overwhelmingly faced charges for offenses like manner of walking, failure to comply, resisting arrest, peace disturbance, and failure to obey. Court practices. African Americans face more procedural barriers in court, leading to longer case durations, more court appearances, and a higher likelihood of warrants. In 2013, 92% of cases resulting in an arrest warrant involved African Americans. Underlying bias. Evidence suggests intentional discrimination as racial disparities were consistent and significant. The practices did not enhance public safety and often contradicted core police objectives. Historical racial bias and explicit racial stereotyping by some officials contributed to these disparities. In Ferguson, these disparities are partly driven by intentional discrimination, violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Evidence of racial bias includes consistent and significant racial disparities in police and court actions, practices disproportionately harming African Americans without enhancing public safety at all, discretionary actions detrimental to African Americans, and consideration of race in threat assessment. Historical opposition to African Americans living in Ferguson persists, and explicit racial bias is evident in communications among police and court officials. This evidence supports the conclusion that Ferguson's law enforcement practices are motivated by discriminatory purposes, denying African Americans equal protection under the law. Ferguson's law enforcement disproportionately impacts African Americans. Violating federal law, data shows African Americans are overrepresented at every stage, from initial contact to court disposition. Although Ferguson Police Department has deficient data practices, existing data reveals significant racial disparities. African Americans face harsher treatment at each stage of enforcement, leading to compounding adverse effects. Data shows black drivers are more likely to face searches, citations, and arrests compared to white drivers. Specifically, 11% of stopped black drivers were searched versus only 5% of white drivers. This indicates significant racial disparities in FPD's enforcement actions. Despite higher search rates, African Americans in Ferguson are 26% less likely to have contraband found than whites, which is 24%, versus 30%. Respectively, this disparity persists across different types of searches, indicating potential bias in officers' suspicions or in their tendency to search African Americans without justified suspicion. This bias, whether explicit or implicit, underscores the inefficiency of such enforcement practices. Additional data reveals further disparities of 31 Terry stop searches, 30 were of black individuals. Of 103 searches requiring both driver and passenger to exit the vehicle, 95 involved black individuals, and 5% of searches of black drivers lasted over half an hour, compared to 1% for white drivers. Each racial disparity in Ferguson's law enforcement is statistically significant, with a likelihood of occurring by chance of less than 1 in 1,000. The combined odds of these disparities occurring by chance are even lower. Ferguson Police Department officers often issue multiple citations in a single incident, disproportionately affecting African Americans. For certain offenses like driving while intoxicated and speeding on state roads or highways, African Americans represent a lower proportion of those charged. African Americans accounted for 72% of speeding citations based on radar or laser, but 80% of those based on other unspecified methods, suggesting they violate the law less frequently as measured by radar compared to officer discretion. Controlling for other factors, the disparity in speeding tickets between African Americans and non-African Americans is 48% larger when citations are issued based on the officer's visual assessment rather than on radar or laser. A statistically significant difference. Concerns regarding pedestrian stops. FPD's inadequate data collection prevents statistical assessment of pedestrian stops. Anecdotal evidence and FPD's records suggest that pedestrian stops predominantly involve African American youth. Arrests and incident reports often describe pedestrian stops involving African Americans. Disparate impact of court practices. The Ferguson Municipal Court's rules and practices disproportionately affect African Americans. Procedural barriers in the court system make it harder for black defendants to resolve changes. Data from 2011 shows black defendants face longer case durations, more mandatory court appearances, and more warrants for failing to meet requirements. Court practices and racial disparities. Procedural barriers and discretion. African Americans in Ferguson struggle to resolve municipal charges despite taking the proper steps. Court officials exercise discretion in ways that disadvantage African Americans. Fines. Analysis of fines for 10 offenses from 2011 to 2013 shows racial disparities. African Americans generally received higher fines, with average fines higher for African Americans in 26 out of 30 data points. For instance, for failure to obey charges in 2013, African Americans were fined an average of $206 compared to the average of $147 for others. Dismissal rates. African Americans are 68% less likely to have their cases dismissed compared to other defendants. For cases marked voided, African Americans are 3 times less likely to receive this outcome. Overall, these findings indicate systemic racial disparities in how court practices and discretionary decisions are applied, disproportionately impacting African Americans. Violations of federal law and discriminatory intent in Ferguson's practices. 1. Violation of federal law. Ferguson's police and court practices have a racially disparate impact on African Americans, violating federal laws like Title VI and the Safe Streets Act. These laws prohibit law enforcement agencies receiving federal funds from engaging in activities that unnecessarily impact individuals based on race, color, or national origin. Even if non-intentional, practices with unnecessary discriminatory impact are unlawful under these statutes. Discriminatory intent and the 14th Amendment. The racial disparities in Ferguson's law enforcement cannot be explained by chance or different rates of legal adherence among races. These disparities are partly due to racial bias in law enforcement practices. Violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, an equal protection violation occurs when neutral laws result in discriminatory effects motivated by discriminatory purposes. Evidence of discriminatory intent includes consistent and significant racial disparities in enforcement actions, direct communications from police and court officials showing racial bias, historical context and background reflecting discriminatory practices. That's about it.